The morning my daughter-in-law handed me that bracelet, I thought it was the kindest thing anyone had done for me since my wife passed. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things that year. Let me tell you what it feels like to be 67 years old, retired, and slowly disappearing from the inside out, while the person responsible sits across from you at Sunday dinner and asks if you want more mashed potatoes. It feels like nothing at first. That is the most terrifying part. It feels like absolutely nothing. My name is not important. What is important is that I spent 41 years working as a civil engineer in Portland, Oregon. I built bridges, literal ones, the kind cars drive over, the kind that have to hold weight, the kind where the math has to be exactly right, or people die. I understood load-bearing structures. I understood stress points. I understood that the thing most likely to bring a bridge down is not one catastrophic event, but a slow and invisible corrosion that nobody thinks to check for until it is already too late. I understand that now in a different way than I used to. My wife Carol died 3 years before any of this happened. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the last morning I held her hand. She was 59 years old, and she had the kind of laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants. After she was gone, I did what a lot of men my age do. I kept moving. I mowed the lawn on schedule. I paid my bills. I showed up to my son's house for dinner every Sunday because Carol had started that tradition and I was not going to be the one to end it. My son, Thomas, was 34 at the time. He worked in commercial real estate. He had his mother's dark eyes and my stubbornness and a way of filling up a room that I had always been proud of. He had married his wife, Renata, about 2 years after Carol died. I had tried to like Renata from the beginning. I want to be clear about that. I genuinely tried. She was polished in a way that made me uncomfortable, the kind of polish that takes effort, that is performed rather than natural. She smiled at the right moments and said the right things and remembered to ask about my old colleagues by name. Thomas was devoted to her in a way that sometimes looked less like love and more like relief, like a man who had found the answer to a question he had been too afraid to ask out loud. They had been married about 14 months when she gave me the bracelet. It was a Sunday in October. The leaves outside their window were doing the thing they do in the Pacific Northwest, turning that particular shade of orange that looks almost too beautiful to be real. We had finished dinner. Thomas had gone to the kitchen to get dessert. Renata reached into the side pocket of her bag, which was sitting on the chair beside her, and she brought out a small velvet box. "I found this at an estate sale," she said. "I know how much you loved old things. It reminded me of something a man with your history would wear." Inside the box was a bracelet. Dark braided leather, with a wide flat clasp, made of some kind of dark metal, almost pewter-colored, with a simple geometric pattern pressed into the surface. It looked old. It looked like something a man might have brought back from somewhere interesting a long time ago. "It's beautiful," I said. And I meant it. "I thought you could wear it when you go on your walks," she said. "Carol always said you needed to accessorize more." She laughed when she said it. I laughed too. It hurt in the specific way things hurt when someone invokes the name of a person you loved and you cannot tell whether they are being kind or strategic. Thomas came back with the cobbler. I put the bracelet on. It fit perfectly on my left wrist, just above where I usually wore my watch. I kept wearing it after I went home that night. I kept wearing it the next morning when I went on my walk along the river path. I kept wearing it every day for the next 4 months. Because it was a kind gesture from my daughter-in-law, and I was a man who was trying very hard to believe that his family was going to be all right. The headaches started in November. Not sharp headaches. Not the kind that stop you in your tracks. The kind that settle in at the base of your skull like a tenant who pays just enough rent to avoid eviction. Dull. Persistent. There every morning when I woke up, and still there at night when I turned off the bedside lamp. I told myself it was the weather change. I told myself it was not drinking enough water. I told myself it was grief, because grief does strange things to the body, and I had read enough about it to know that it does not always announce itself as sadness. By December, I was tired in a way I had never been tired before. Not sleepy tired, structurally tired, like something load-bearing inside me had quietly buckled. I would sit down in the afternoon to read and wake up 2 hours later with the book still open in my lap and no memory of closing my eyes. I started skipping my river walks because my legs felt strange, not painful, exactly, but unreliable, like ground that looks solid but shifts when you put weight on it. I made an appointment with my doctor in January. He was a good doctor, Dr. Harmon, the kind who actually listens. He ran blood work. He checked my blood pressure. He asked me about my sleep, my diet, my stress levels. Everything came back in the normal range for a man my age. He adjusted my blood pressure medication slightly and told me to try to get more sunlight. I tried to get more sunlight. The symptoms did not improve. By February, my hands had developed a faint tremor, barely noticeable, the kind of thing only I would catch, because I was a man who used to draw precise lines by hand, and I knew exactly how steady my hands were supposed to be. My hair, which had always been thick for my age, was coming out in small amounts in the shower drain. Not dramatic handfuls. Quiet, steady loss, the kind you could pretend not to notice if you were determined enough. I went back to Dr. Harmon in March. He referred me to a neurologist. The neurologist ran more tests. An MRI, a nerve conduction study. Everything came back inconclusive, or within the range of normal aging. The neurologist used the phrase age-related changes 3 times in 15 minutes, and I sat in his office and nodded and felt something cold settling in my chest that I did not yet have a name for. Thomas called me every Sunday morning. He asked how I was feeling. I told him I was fine because I did not have a better answer, and because telling your son you are afraid is not something that comes easily when you have spent 40 years being the person other people called when they were afraid. Renata always got on the phone at some point during those calls. She was warm and attentive in the way she always was. She asked about my symptoms with what sounded like genuine concern. Once, in April, she said, "You know, I read that men your age often develop these kinds of symptoms when they stop having a clear daily structure. Maybe you need a project, something to keep your mind focused." I told her that was a good point. I thought about it for several days afterward. It seemed reasonable. It seemed kind. I was still wearing the bracelet. My daughter Patricia lived in Tucson. She was 31, 4 years younger than Thomas, and she had her mother's instincts, that particular kind of intelligence that operates on pattern recognition rather than linear logic, that notices the thing you are not saying louder than the thing you are. She called me every week, too, on Thursday evenings. In April, she started calling more frequently. She said she could hear something in my voice. "Dad, you sound far away," she said one Thursday. Not just tired, far away. I told her I was fine. She flew up in May without telling me she was coming. I opened the door and she was standing on my porch with a rolling suitcase, and the expression her mother used to make when she had decided something was going to happen and was not interested in discussing it. "I'm staying for 2 weeks," she said. I did not argue. Truthfully, I was relieved in a way I could not have admitted out loud. She noticed the bracelet on the second day. We were sitting in the kitchen having coffee, and she reached across the table and touched the clasp. "Where did this come from?" she asked. I told her. "Renata. Estate sale. October. A kind gesture." Patricia looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. She turned my wrist over gently and looked at the underside of my forearm, just below where the clasp rested. There was a faint discoloration there. I had noticed it a few weeks earlier and told myself it was bruising from something I could not remember. A small area, about the size of a silver dollar, where the skin looked slightly darker and somehow thinner than the skin around it. "How long has that been there?" she asked. "A month, maybe," I said. I thought I bumped it on something. She did not say anything else right then. She picked up her coffee cup, but I saw the way her jaw set. That particular tightening I had watched her inherit from her mother, and I knew she was thinking hard about something she was not ready to say yet. 2 days later, she asked me if she could take the bracelet to get it looked at. She said she had a friend, a woman named Diane, who dealt in antique jewelry and estate pieces, and she wanted to know if it was actually valuable since it had been given to me as a gift from an estate sale. "It might be worth something," she said. "You should know what you have." I took it off and gave it to her. That was the first night in 4 months I slept without a headache. I did not connect those two things immediately. The mind is very good at not connecting things it does not want to connect. Patricia came back the next afternoon. She came through the front door and she stood in the hallway, And she looked at me with the expression I remembered from when her mother was in the hospital, that specific look of someone who has received information they were hoping they would not receive. "Sit down, Dad," she said. I sat down. She told me that she had not taken the bracelet to her friend Diane. She had taken it to a materials testing lab at Portland State University, where she had called in a favor from a professor she knew through her work. She had asked the professor to analyze the composition of the metal clasp. The clasp contained thallium, a compound of it embedded in the metal in a way that was designed to release slowly through skin contact. She used a phrase I had to ask her to repeat. Something about ion transfer and perspiration and surface area and prolonged exposure. The professor had been alarmed enough to document everything and had asked if she intended to contact authorities. I sat with that for a long time. Thallium. I knew the word from toxicology reports I had encountered peripherally over the years in engineering safety contexts. A heavy metal, colorless, odorless, tasteless, historically used in rat poison. Absorbed through the skin. Symptoms that mimic neurological disorders, autoimmune conditions, the general deterioration of aging, headaches, fatigue, tremors, hair loss. Notoriously difficult to detect in standard blood work because most physicians do not think to test for it unless they already suspect poisoning. Most physicians do not think to test for it. I understood then why every test had come back normal. Nobody had been testing for the right thing because nobody had imagined the right question. I want to tell you what that realization feels like. I want to describe it accurately because I think it is important to be accurate about things that matter. It does not feel like anger at first. It feels like a physical sensation, something structural, like the moment an engineer realizes the calculation was wrong from the beginning and the bridge was never actually safe. Everything looks the same. Nothing has visibly changed. But the ground is different underneath you, and you know it, and you cannot unknow it. The bracelet had been on my wrist since October. It was now May. 7 months. I thought about the Sunday dinners. I thought about the phone calls. I thought about Renata handing me that velvet box with Carol's name in her mouth, and that carefully calibrated smile. I thought about the referrals, and the inconclusive tests, and the neurologist saying, age-related changes, and me nodding, always nodding, because I was a reasonable man who trusted institutions and data, and the people who were supposed to love me. I thought about my will, which Thomas and Patricia each knew the contents of, which left the house and the majority of my savings to be split equally between them. I thought about a conversation I had not thought about in months, a comment Thomas had made last fall, casual, over dinner, about how he and Renata had found a house they loved, but the financing was complicated. How he had said, almost as an aside, that things would be simpler eventually. I had not understood what he meant at the time. I understood it now. Patricia wanted to call the police immediately. We sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours that evening, and I asked her to give me time to think. Not much time, a few days. I needed to understand what I was doing before I did it, because I had spent my life building things that were meant to hold, and I did not want to act from the shaking inside me. I wanted to act from something more solid. She agreed, reluctantly, on the condition that I do 3 things. Stop wearing the bracelet, which I had already done. See a specialist in toxicology, which she had already made an appointment for, and not contact Thomas or Renata until we had a plan. I agreed to all 3 conditions. The toxicology specialist confirmed everything within a week. He found traces of thallium still in my system through a specific urine test, a test that is not part of any standard panel, a test that has to be ordered deliberately by someone who is already looking for it. He was a quiet man, Dr. Okafor, with very precise speech and a stillness about him that I found steadying. He told me that my exposure level, while serious, was not yet at a point that had caused permanent damage. He told me the fact that I had stopped wearing the bracelet when I did likely mattered quite a bit. He asked me how the exposure had occurred. I told him. He did not react dramatically. He made a note. He said, very carefully, that in his professional opinion this situation required law enforcement involvement, and that he had a legal obligation to report it. I told him I understood, and that I intended to contact them myself. That night I called Patricia and we talked for 2 hours. She had been doing her own research during the week, quietly, methodically, the way she did everything. She had found that thallium compounds can be synthesized and embedded in metal alloys. It requires knowledge and access that most people do not have. It is not something you stumble into. It is something you plan. She had also been paying attention to Renata's background in a way she had not been before. Renata had a graduate degree in chemistry from a university in Eastern Europe before she came to the States. I had known this fact. I had filed it away as interesting the way you file away facts about people you are trying to like. I had not understood what it meant until now. I want to tell you about the moment I called my son. It was a Thursday evening, 10 days after Patricia told me about the lab results. I had spoken to a detective by then, a woman named Sergeant Delgado, who had the same quality of careful stillness as Dr. Okafor, who had listened to everything I said and asked precise questions and told me that building a case would require patience and documentation. She had asked if I was willing to make a recorded call. I was willing. I called Thomas on his cell phone. He answered on the second ring, which was normal. He asked how I was feeling, which was normal. I told him I had not been sleeping well. I told him I had been thinking about the bracelet Renata gave me. There was a pause, very small, the kind of pause that lasts less than a second but contains something, a recalibration, a micro-adjustment, the kind of thing you would not notice if you were not already listening for it. "It's a nice piece," he said. "I've stopped wearing it," I said. Another pause. "Longer this time. How come?" "I've been having some skin irritation," I said, under the clasp. I had a doctor look at it. The silence that followed that sentence was the most informative silence I have ever heard in my life. I had spent 40 years listening to silences in meetings and negotiations and difficult conversations. I knew what a silence full of nothing felt like. I knew what a silence full of calculation felt like. This was the second kind. "I'm sure it's nothing," Thomas said. His voice had shifted in some small but precise way, the way a structure shifts when the load distribution changes. "Some people have reactions to certain metals." "That's probably it," I said. We talked for another 4 minutes about unremarkable things. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time without moving. The recording equipment was still running. Outside the window, it was finally getting dark at a late hour the way it does in Portland in late spring, the sky going that long, slow purple that Carol had always said looked like a promise. I had loved my son for 34 years. I had taught him to ride a bicycle in a parking lot on a Sunday morning. I had sat with him in a hospital waiting room when he broke his arm falling out of a tree at age 9, and had held his hand and told him everything was going to be fine. I had danced badly at his wedding and meant every word of the toast I gave. I do not know at what point Renata became the primary architect of what happened. I do not know how much of it was her design, and how much of it was my son's complicity, or his willful blindness, or his active participation. The investigation would spend months trying to establish that, and I will tell you what it concluded in a moment. But sitting in my kitchen that night, I realized that the answer to that question, while legally important, did not change the thing that had been done to me or the person who had given me the bracelet while speaking my dead wife's name. Sergeant Delgado and her team moved faster than I had expected. They had a warrant within a week of my recorded call. The search of Thomas and Renata's home turned up several things that mattered. A notebook in Renata's handwriting that contained what was later described in court documents as research notes on thallium dosing and absorption rates, correspondence between Renata and a contact overseas that referenced the bracelet specifically, and financial records that showed they were significantly in debt, the kind of debt that a house and a career in real estate and a lifestyle built on appearance creates when the underlying structure is not as solid as it looks. Renata was arrested first. Thomas was arrested 48 hours later after he attempted to contact me in a way that Sergeant Delgado had specifically instructed me to document. He called on a Saturday morning. He told me he needed to talk to me. He said things had gotten complicated, and he needed me to understand. He said, and I want to remember this accurately, because I have thought about it many times, since he said, "Dad, I never wanted it to go this far." She said it would just make you seem older. She said you would decide on your own to make things simpler. He said she told him it would just make me seem older. I did not say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "I know, Thomas." That was all. Sergeant Delgado had everything she needed. The trial took 11 months. The courtroom was not dramatic in the way people imagine courtrooms to be dramatic. It was procedural and precise and exhausting. Patricia sat beside me every day she could get away from Tucson. She had taken to holding my hand during the difficult parts, which was something she had not done since she was a child, and I found that I was grateful for it in a way I did not have the words for. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Renata was convicted of aggravated assault and attempted murder in the first degree. She was sentenced to 22 years. Her attorney had argued that the thallium levels were not high enough to constitute an attempt on my life, that the intent had only been to incapacitate and manipulate. The prosecutor argued, successfully, that a chemistry graduate who researches dosing rates and embeds a heavy metal compound in a piece of jewelry, worn daily against the skin for 7 months, has made her intent sufficiently clear. Thomas was convicted of conspiracy and complicity. He was sentenced to 9 years. His attorney argued that he had not known the full scope of what Renata was doing. The prosecution introduced the financial records and the phone logs and a series of text messages that made that argument difficult to sustain. The jury spent considerably less time on Thomas than they did on Renata. I sat in that courtroom and watched my son receive his sentence, and I thought about the parking lot on a Sunday morning and his 9-year-old hand in mine, and I let myself feel all of it at once, because I believed that not feeling it would have cost me something I could not afford to lose. I want to tell you something about the months after the verdict. People asked me often whether I was angry. I was. I want to be honest about that. I was angry in a way that felt geological deep, slow, the kind of anger that does not express itself as shouting, but as a fundamental shift in how you understand the ground you're standing on. I was angry at Renata for obvious reasons. I was angry at Thomas in a different way, a way that is harder to describe, the anger of a person who realizes that the love they gave was not returned in the form they thought, that the bridge they thought they had built was never carrying the weight they believed it was. But I also want to tell you something that is harder to say, and that I think matters more. I did not let the anger become the whole of what I was. That is not a small thing. It is actually the hardest engineering problem I have ever worked on. How do you remain structurally sound after the kind of damage that should, by rights, bring you down? How do you continue to hold weight? Dr. Okafor told me that my full recovery was possible and likely. My hair has come back. The tremor in my hands is gone. I still walk along the river path most mornings, and the legs that felt unreliable under me have become reliable again. Patricia calls me every Thursday evening, as she always has, and now on Tuesday mornings too, which started during the trial, and which neither of us has suggested stopping. She planted a garden in my backyard during one of her visits, tomatoes and zucchini, and a row of marigolds that her mother would have approved of. I maintain it with more attention than I have given anything in years. I have not spoken to Thomas since the sentencing. That may change. I have not decided. What I know is that the question of forgiveness is not the same as the question of contact, and I am taking my time with both of them, because I am 68 years old, and I have earned the right to take my time. What I want you to take from this, if you take anything at all, is this. The thing that saved my life was not dramatic. It was not a confrontation or a revelation or a moment of cinematic clarity. It was my daughter noticing that I sounded far away. It was a woman with a rolling suitcase showing up on my porch because she had decided something was going to happen and was not interested in discussing it. It was a Thursday evening phone call that had been happening every week for years because someone who loved me had decided that consistent presence was worth the effort. Pay attention to who shows up consistently. Pay attention to the people who listen to what you are not saying. Pay attention to gifts from people whose kindness has always had a slight performance quality to it. And if your hands are not as steady as they used to be, and the doctors keep telling you it is just your age, and something in you does not believe them, trust that something. You built things for a long time. You know what solid feels like. You know when the math is off. Trust that. I am still here. I am walking along the river most mornings. The leaves are doing the thing they do in October again, that orange that looks almost too beautiful to be real. Carol would have said something about it that I would have written down if I had known I would want to remember it later. I remember it anyway. That is the thing about love that tries to take something from you. It cannot take what was already part of how you were built. I am still here.